Welcome to Understanding the Realities of Incarcerated Transgender Men. I'm Louis Marvin, and I'm with the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, or NSVRC. We are a division of Respect Together, and I just have a couple of housekeeping notes to share before I pass the mic to our presenters, Kris, Mady, and Kai Peterson, and they will do a fuller introduction of themselves in a moment. I want to share just really quickly that this webinar is being recorded in English and Spanish and will be made available on our website, nsvrc.org. If you've joined in the last couple minutes, please do make sure to select one of those languages, English or Spanish, and there are instructions on how to do that in the chat. Closed captioning is available today. You can select that in your Zoom options. And you can contact me in the chat if you're having any technical difficulties, and also to participate in prompts from our presenters. Our presenters are asking that you use the chat for those purposes. And if you have questions that you'd like the presenters to ask, please use the Q&A function in Zoom. And we'll review those and we'll get to those either in the middle of the presentation, or we will also have some time at the end to address any lingering questions. And again, it looks like our recording is happening and we're all set. So I will turn it over to you, Kai and Kris. You can take it from here. Thanks for being here and for being our presenters on understanding the realities of incarcerated transgender men.
Thank you so much, Louis. And thank you for folks that are already popping in the chat. I see a lot of familiar names, so it's really exciting to have you on this webinar. My name is Kris Mady. I'm a program director with Just Detention International. I use he, him, and they, them pronouns. For folks who have never heard of JDI before, Just Detention International is a health and human rights organization that seeks to end sexual abuse in all forms of detention. We carry out our mission by working with corrections officials, rape crisis advocates, and policymakers to make detention facilities safe. We work to promote public attitudes that value the dignity and safety for people in detention. And we support incarcerated survivors of sexual abuse and sexual harassment. It's our fundamental principle behind our work that when the government takes away someone's freedom, it takes on an absolute responsibility to protect that person's safety. No matter what crime someone may have committed, rape is not part of the penalty. I'm so excited to be here today to be talking about this topic and to be joined by Kai Peterson. Kai, do you want to introduce yourself?
Okay, hi, my name is Kai Peterson. I am the executive director and founder of Freedom Overground, which is a nonprofit that does direct support services for transgender and gender non-conforming individuals that are incarcerated. I'm also a member of Just Detention International Survivor Council. I enjoy working with both of those organizations because we're working with both of those organizations. They make sure that people that are incarcerated, their rights are respected and that they're treated like humans. Back to you, Kris.
Thanks, Kai. Louis, would you mind moving the slide forward? One more. Yeah. So we know that transgender men represent a rich tapestry of identities and lived experiences, and we really hope to touch upon that today. A lot of the topics that we're going to be discussing, honestly, really haven't been explored in research. Research on transgender men is incredibly limited. And when we're thinking about how transmasculine identities intersect with incarceration, this research and dialogue is even further limited. And we really just don't have a lot of information. So it's really exciting to be here today to be talking about this. Few transmasculine survivors of sexual abuse receive culturally competent counseling and crisis services. And today's webinar, we're going to review what some of these challenges that currently and formerly incarcerated transgender men face, We're also going to include some guidance on how advocates can get involved in increasing access to trauma-informed services to transmasculine people. To start us off, we have a poll just to try to get a sense of where you feel like you fit in terms of your knowledge. And so we ask that you select one of these options. The options are, I have a strong understanding of trans men and their experience. I have some understanding of trans men and their experiences. I have little understanding of trans men and their experiences. And I have no understanding of trans men and their experiences. So if you want to pick one of these, wherever you feel like your understanding is in this moment, helps us get a sense of where folks are at and who's joining us today and where your knowledge is. So take a moment to answer that poll. We'll give folks another moment to answer. All right, Louis, I think we can close the poll. Awesome. So it looks like the majority of people selected that they have some understanding of trans men and their experiences, with about 30% of people saying they have little understanding, and some folks saying they have no understanding, and a couple of folks saying they have strong understanding. So it looks like we have a diversity of knowledge on this webinar today, which is really exciting because I think we're going to be talking about things that maybe folks haven't heard before, but if you do have experiences or knowledge, we are going to have a few opportunities for you to share that as well. So I do want to note that this is not a Trans 101 training. So we're not going to be going over what the different identity terms mean. Rather, we're going to be focusing in on the experiences of incarcerated transgender men. And we are going to be using the terms transgender man and transmasculine throughout this webinar, as well as terms like cisgender. And so if you feel that maybe your knowledge isn't quite there yet with understanding what these terms mean, I really encourage you to check out some other great trainings where you can get more of a base knowledge of trans folks and their identities. But we're just going to hop right into it. And we want to talk about how the discrimination that many transgender men experience can lead to incarceration. Many transgender men experience a lack of social and family support. A lot of folks are kicked out of their homes and struggle to find housing and full employment and job opportunities because of their identity when they come out. And unfortunately, we know that discrimination does not stop there. Abuse and violence is part of many trans men's lives, and transgender men are 5 times more likely than cisgender men to experience violent victimization in their lifetime. Transgender men experience pervasive discrimination, including employment and education discrimination, housing discrimination, and healthcare discrimination. This, in combination with a cycle of bullying, early victimization, and homelessness, can lead to many engaging in underground economies, including survival sex work, involvement in the drug trade, or violent acts of self-defense. And these crimes, in turn, lead to increased police stops and arrests for trans folks and time inside jails and prisons. In addition to being stopped and arrested for less than valid reasons, police misconduct is high, and trans people often experience multiple forms of victimization, often being unfairly arrested and being assaulted and harassed by law enforcement. In a 2011 study done by the Trans Equality Organization, 62% of transgender men reported never or only sometimes being treated with respect by law enforcement. So due to these factors, Unfortunately, we know that 1 in 6 transgender people has been incarcerated at some point in their lives, and trans people are incredibly highly overrepresented in detention, especially trans folks of color. So I'm going to pass it to Kai to share more about some specific experiences about how discrimination and this violence prior to incarceration can sometimes lead someone to being locked up in prison or jail.
Thank you, Kris. I think I'm gonna try to be quick, because I could get stuck on one slide. But I'm gonna try to be quick with this one. Um, for many transgender men like myself, especially people of color, when living in different communities, the smaller areas that are the rural areas, um, we're more likely to face violence and different types of discrimination when it comes to housing, as you said before, finding jobs. Even in the workplace, there's different types of discrimination that happens. A lot of times it either results in violence or us having to pretty much run away to avoid some type of violence against us for just existing. Um, it doesn't really make any sense. But at the same time, because of those factors and those things, a lot of times, a lot of transgender men are put into situations that cause them to have contact with law enforcement and then be sent to jails, prison, or detention centers. Um, thank you for letting me share, Kris.
Yeah. And Louis, you can go to the next slide. And I think, as Kai and I mentioned, because there's such an overrepresentation of trans men in detention, because of that discrimination, because of the way that trans men are treated, as Kai mentioned, it's more likely that we're going to have contact with law enforcement and then end up in detention centers. And unfortunately, we know that when someone is incarcerated, the challenges that transgender men face continues. And so while in some states, transgender women have begun to be housed in facilities that match their gender, this has really only happened for a handful of transgender men across the country. In the vast majority of facilities and places, transgender men are housed in detention facilities designated for women. The identities of transgender men are often erased, with very few people understanding what trans man even means, or that someone housed in a facility for women might be a transgender man. Correctional staff who have had training on transgender people often only ever receive information on transgender women, leaving a huge gap in their understanding of trans men. And while ignorance and a lack of training is a piece, there's also sometimes a complete denial that transgender men are real, with staff saying things like trans men don't exist or that trans men are not real men. And because of this deeply entrenched anti-trans bias and often denial of their identity, transgender men are sometimes mischaracterized as troublemakers. They're frequently targeted for increased disciplinary sanctions more than their cisgender women peers. Trans men are often specifically disciplined for consensual contact with other incarcerated people and are placed in segregation because of those perceptions. And unfortunately, we know with increased disciplinary sanctions, this comes with a multitude of issues, increase in things like frequent bed moves, being placed in solitary confinement, and ultimately sometimes increased time on someone's sentence. We know that this can further increase the isolation that transgender men experience when they're incarcerated. When someone's incarcerated, they're already separated from the support of the outside world, and transgender men who may have fractured family relationships due to their family not understanding their identity. This might mean that they are not in contact with anyone in the outside world. Many of the transgender men that I've spoken to also report being kept separate from each other within the facility. And so they're unable to even connect with people like themselves and they're being moved so frequently within a facility that they're never able to establish any social connections or support. And Kai, I know you and I have talked a lot about how trans men's identities are often denied and erased in detention. And I'm wondering if you can share a little bit more about how this looked in your situation and in things that you've heard from other folks that are incarcerated.
Okay, Kris. Thank you again. For me, the way that this looked was I was told by the warden of my institution. I was incarcerated in Georgia in a female's institution, and the warden told me that trans men do not exist. They had heard of trans women, so they were, I guess, a little familiar with that. But they told me that I pretty much didn't exist, and I was standing in front of them. Um, I'd done a lot of time in solitary confinement because of them targeting me. Because I refused a lot of searches because I just felt as if it was not necessary. Um, I was. It, it's it's a really bad thing, and it's kind of touchy for me because in a lot of those situations and things that happened, it was just to humiliate me and make me feel less than. I was told that I was pretending to be a man, that I didn't know who I was. It was a lot of times that those things happened, and I did not have anyone to talk to on the outside about it at first until I got support from my family and friends. But being inside of that institution and not having any contact with other trans guys or with anyone that, even identified as gender non-confirm conforming, even not having that, it was very hard for me because, I was seen as different. I was treated different, not only by the staff, but also by the other people that were incarcerated with me. And that led to some pretty tough times. And it eventually led up to me attempting suicide in that institution just because I was tired of being alone. I was tired of being treated different. I got tired of just being in isolation and not being able to talk to my family. So it really hurt. Um, I think I'll pass it back to you, Kris.
Oh, and thank you, Kai, for sharing. And it looks like you're getting a lot of appreciation in the chat. I think just this denial of identity, it's something that's so intrinsic to who we are. And when people are saying that's not really who you are, or they're saying hateful things, like Kai mentioned, it can just have such a profound impact on how we're doing mentally, how we're doing physically. And it's an incredibly difficult experience. And I think when we're thinking about transgender men, already transgender men are virtually invisible in our outside world. And so when we apply this to detention, it's just even stronger. And so I think just thinking about the impact that that has on people is just really, really a lot, as Kai's mentioned. And Louis, if you want to go to the next slide. I think it's always really powerful to hear from folks themselves, which is why I'm just so appreciative to Kai for sharing his story and his experiences. And I also want to just uplift a few quotes from different transgender men that I've spoken to who are incarcerated. And as I mentioned, many trans people that we work with, they're not able to use their name. Well, many of them are not able to use their pronouns within the facility. Even once they make it very clear to staff, there's often just an absolute refusal by facilities to validate someone's identity. So these are a few quotes from two different transgender men that I spoke to, both of whom were incarcerated in prisons for women. The first man that I spoke to just told me that he felt like his existence is being erased and being shoved to the side. Another guy that I spoke to said that they're often called an it by staff, and that staff will laugh at them and say that their identity, that they don't believe in that. And again, these are things that people are hearing time and time again, day after day, and there's just no way for them to escape this language and the things that people are saying to them because they're locked up. And Louis, if you want to go to the next slide. And so we know that for many, accessing transition-related care, whether it be social, legal, or medical transition, is vital for people to be able to live their life as who they are. But we know that access to these things is incredibly difficult for incarcerated transgender men across the country. And I do want to just mention too, that what Kai is sharing is about his experience in Georgia. But a lot of these experiences are echoed throughout the country and throughout the world, where transgender men are just not able to access things. Even here in California, where we are seen as a very progressive state, folks still are not able to access these resources. Much information about transition is often restricted and limited within a detention setting. And someone who's incarcerated can't just hop on the internet and research, what care can I receive? How can I get support? There's no access to the internet. And so their care and their knowledge about their care is left to the mercy of the facility. And the facility has to be open to providing that information. And sometimes that information is both lacking and outdated. But it's really important to remember that someone's access to medical or social transition doesn't make them more or less trans, but their ability to access and utilize transition-related support is often vital for their health and well-being. And as I mentioned, even in states where there's both laws and policies protecting people's rights and protecting their rights to access transgender-related care, unfortunately, we know that they're frequently not followed. That they're only followed more specifically for transgender women, because again, folks just don't have the knowledge about transgender men. And individuals are often left to fight for their basic rights every step of the way. So most places do have some sort of policy stating that transgender men can access gender-affirming clothing, including boxers and binders. However, most people that I've spoken to have talked about issues they've had with actually getting those items that would help ease their gender dysphoria. Getting assistance with things like name changes or gender marker changes is also a challenge, and many transmasculine people are unable to get their ID cards changed or their information in a prison or jail system changed so that they can have that match the name they go by and their gender. So sometimes people's photograph and their name really just doesn't match how they look. And they have to look at that incongruent picture, that incongruent name day after day. There's also just a strong lack of access to competent medical and mental health professionals within correctional systems. Again, looking at the trans equality study from 2011, I know someone put in the chat that they did just post their new results. That's absolutely true. A lot of the full report hasn't been released, so we're still kind of waiting to see some of the information. So that's why we have the information from the 2011 study. But in the 2011 study, 40% of respondents who had been taking hormones before their incarceration were prohibited from taking their hormones in the past year while they were in jail, prison, or juvenile detention. So that means even though folks had been taking hormone replacement therapy prior to incarceration, once they were incarcerated, they were no longer able to access this. Several people we've spoken to discussed when they requested to start HRT and to get medical support to medically transition, they were instead put on mandatory mental health medication rather than getting support for their medical transition. So this doesn't even begin to cover the challenges when it says gender affirming surgeries, which almost across the board is not something that transgender men can access while in detention. And due to this discrimination and inability to access gender affirming care, we do see incredibly high rates of substance use, increased risk of HIV transmission, and an increased risk of suicide among transgender men, as Kai mentioned. And this is an incredibly dehumanizing experience and results not only in that individual experiencing their own pain and dysphoria, but also can expose that person to increased harassment and violence, which we'll talk about shortly. And Kai, I know you started to share a little bit about your experiences. And I wonder if you can share specifically about just limited access to transgender related care that you experienced while detained.
Okay, Kris. Let's see, I had to pull this back down. I'm sorry. Okay, so to start off, the prison was against it. I requested hormones in 2014. I did not receive hormones until 2016. I had to continually write request concern forms to the medical staff, to mental health, and to the warden of the institution I was in. So they fought with me all of that time, saying that according to their SOP, which is the standard of operating procedure, each institution has one. They said according to that, they don't have to give me anything that I was not on prior to entering their institution. So it was a long process to get started. And then once I was receiving HRT, they made it to where I would miss shots. So it would be times where I wasn't able to go to the medical unit and get my meds. Sometimes the nurse would stab me too hard and I would bleed and all of the medicine would come out. And it was this one time that I actually went through like withdrawals from not having um, the HRT, and I started to menstruate, and they refused to give me anything for that. Um, the institution that I was in, it did not want to give anything, not changes in personal hygiene items, clothing items, nothing that was requested. Um, so the only way that I was able to get any of those things was through outside help. I had to continually write home and have my family and friends either call to that institution, call to the Board of Parole and Pardons, like they had to continually call, because without having someone on the outside fighting for you when you're inside, you're not going to get the support that you need. You're not going to get the things that you need without having someone who is on the outside of that institution constantly calling and talking to them. And even with that happening, a lot of the times I was still punished. I was refused visits with my family. They restricted my phone privileges because they said that I was causing problems for them by letting people know what was going on inside of that institution.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Kai. And I think everything that you're sharing just really speaks to me in the sense that I think people sometimes don't understand the absolute necessity that it is for folks who are interested and want to be medically transitioning to be able to access that care and to be able to present themselves in the way that they are, in the way that who they are, and not being able to do that and then being treated like you're asking for extra, asking for more when you're just trying to live, to be able to be even minimally comfortable just in your own body and being who you are. And I did get a question in the question and answer section that I wanted to talk about. Someone was asking if we think that the limited funding for healthcare and detention institutions might also add to the lack of gender affirming care for both transgender men and transgender women. So I think limited healthcare and detention and funding around that absolutely adds to the fact that trans folks might not be able to access the care that they need. And that often basic health care, including mental health care services, are often just so stretched beyond capacity. And while I do think funding has a big piece of it, I think when we're talking about trans-related care, it's often not even considered to be basic healthcare, even though it is. So I think it's sometimes just that thinking about it. And I think if we can shift our mindset to seeing trans-related care as part of basic healthcare, because for trans folks, that is basic healthcare. That is our daily needs. That's something that I need. I need to be able to access my HRT to be able to be who I am. That is part of my basic healthcare. But I think despite the fact that the American Psychological Association, WPATH, many folks who study this state this, really fantastic health organizations have also reiterated that. The fact is that facilities don't necessarily see it that way. And often medical professionals don't see trans-related care as part of basic health care, even though it is. So I think while funding has a piece to play, it's actually much more about our culture around treating trans people. And that is really, really tricky. So that is a piece there. And I just want to make sure I answered that in the chat. Yeah. Thank you for adding all these wonderful messages in the chat. Yeah, I just want to, again, uplift this comment just about the care being so needed, even, and it's often considered not medically necessary when it absolutely is. Yeah. Okay. And so, like I mentioned, oftentimes when people are not able to feel comfortable in their own body, when people are not able to access the care that they need, when their dysphoria is heightened, oftentimes that can expose that person to increased harassment and violence. Incarcerated transgender men are often targeted for violence and abuse. And this abuse and harassment often directly targets their identity as a trans person. For folks that work with trans survivors in the community, we know that the rates of sexual abuse for transgender people is incredibly high. And many studies show that between 50 and 90% of transgender people are sexually assaulted in their lifetime. So these high rates of sexual abuse are very much echoed when a trans person is incarcerated. And there have not really been robust studies that look at the victimization of incarcerated transgender men. Smaller reports have shown that at least 6% of transgender men reported sexual assaults by staff or other incarcerated people. But this doesn't begin to cover the daily harassment that trans men experience in detention, including repeated and deliberate misgendering by staff and other incarcerated people. Kai also mentioned abusive searches, and unfortunately, abusive searches by staff are very common for transgender men. Several people that I spoke to, again, both incarcerated in a prison for women in the West Coast, every single person transgender man that I spoke to disclosed having experienced an abusive search at some point where staff would grope their chest or their crotch at length while making comments about their body, stating things about them being a man or not being a man, and really just saying really inappropriate things about their body. Transgender men also experience corrective rape or sexual assault by staff or other incarcerated people. And many survivors recount being told that the rape would help make them a woman, or they would be forced to perform sexual acts on others because it would prove that they're a real man. So these are things that we hear all the time from survivors that we work with, and they have just a horrible impact on people's ability to live and people's ability to heal. Again, because a lot of this violence just directly attacks that person's identity and something so intrinsic to who they are. Sometimes the impact of that assault can have really lifelong effects. And abuse and violence, like the types of things that I've shared, are 100% prohibited across the board in every state, every jurisdiction. However, what we see is that when a report is made, it's often not taken seriously. and very little, if anything, is done to prevent that person from being harmed. Sometimes when a survivor comes forward about sexual abuse, they are placed in solitary confinement within the institution in the attempt to keep the survivor safe. But instead, this can take an enormous psychological toll, as well as causing issues with programming and access to other resources. Again, all of this goes against what what our laws say, what the Prison Rape Elimination Act recommends. But unfortunately, that's what we see most often take place. And Kai, I want to turn it to you and see if you can share a little bit about your experiences with violence in prison. And I know you've worked with a lot of folks and really been able to help them with their healing process, and anything kind of that they experience and patterns of issues that transgender men that you've worked with have experienced while detained.
Okay, thank you, Kris. I think the first thing that I'm going to say, starting off, is listening to you talking. I know we've had this conversation before, but just being, just being in that, just thinking back to my own personal experience and being in an institution, and honestly, it was my first time ever being incarcerated. And at this point, I knew nothing about any laws or anything that was put in place to protect me. I didn't know that I had rights once I was inside of that institution. No one informed me of it. Um, but being told by a senior staff member, male staff member, that I deserved to be raped so that I would know I was a woman, that was one that was one thing that it hurt, and it made me feel so low and dirty. And it was just, a lot of times the male staff were able to see our files, and they would share that information with, amongst each other or with other inmates. And that's terrible. They continue to misgender me. And even with some of the people that I speak with now that are still incarcerated, it still happens. They still get misgendered. They're still not respected as people. A lot of those individuals don't really talk much about being sexually assaulted, but the comments and the harassment is still happening. Those searches are still going on, and it shouldn't happen. And there's so much that can be done, and there's so many different laws and policies in place that are supposed to protect those individuals that are incarcerated. But a lot of those individuals do not even know the rights that they have. And that's why my work with JDI is so important, because JDI helped me when I was in that bad place, when I was being harassed daily, thrown into solitary confinement for months at a time. And JDI came to do a pre-audit, and Miss Linda McFarland came in. I wasn't going to speak to her because we didn't speak to people from the outside. But that one interaction with her changed everything for me. And I will forever be grateful for that. Um, I think I'll pass it back to you, Kris.
Thank you, Kai. And it's honestly such a privilege to be speaking with you today, Kai, and to have you share about your experiences. And I think I love the last thing that you shared about, being able to get support, and just the meaning that had for you. And that's why I'm just so excited to be doing this webinar today, because I think we have so many people on this call that, like, there's just so much love coming in from the chat. But I think the folks that are joining this call, they're here because you want to help. You want to be able to do something. I think, we can share all day long about the challenges, but we also want to be able to share some ways that you can support folks that are incarcerated, support incarcerated transgender men. And because this is not something that people are talking about. People are not talking about transgender men, and they're certainly not talking about transgender men that are incarcerated. So the fact that we have so many people on this call today, like, it honestly makes me so happy, because I'm like, okay, we're talking about this. We're starting to get movement on this, in this work, and doing and making changes for people. And I wonder if we can shift to the next slide. I do want to briefly touch on both. I know we touched about the challenges that folks face while they're incarcerated, but we also want to talk about some of the challenges that transgender men experience during reentry. And I know Kai does a lot of amazing work with folks who are coming out of the system. So I'm going to give him a chance to talk about that in a moment. But we know that, unfortunately, the cycle of violence and discrimination that we saw prior to incarceration, that continues during incarceration, also continues when someone's released back into a world where they're facing that same discrimination. And they're oftentimes placed back in detention again, because this whole system is just not caring for them. We know that housing is one of the largest issues that people face when they leave detention. And this is across the board for anyone that's leaving prison and jail, but it's especially true for transgender people, as virtually no spaces are open to transgender men. Post-incarceration housing often does not allow or will not serve trans people. Men's post-incarceration facilities are not safe for transgender men, and most women's facilities are faith-based and refuse LGBTQIA people. Frequently, prisons are supposed to release people with some sort of form of federal or state-recognized ID when they leave. Sometimes they don't. But when they do, often that identity documentation does not match with what the person looks like, especially if they've been transitioning medically while inside. And so this can make it difficult for that person to find employment or apply for state resources and get housing. And without having things like a name change, if their physical appearance doesn't match which is on their ID card, this can cause other problems like harassment, threats, discrimination, or just being denied services without any explanation why. It also can make someone a target for increased police violence, and increases their chances of being arrested again for possible interactions with law enforcement. So, for example, if you're pulled over in a minor traffic infraction, you present the officer with an ID, and your ID doesn't look like who you are. Suddenly now you're having a conversation with the officers. Why does this ID say female when you look like a man? Or is this name fake? Is this a fake ID? And you're getting threats of fraud, threats about being arrested again. And again, that just increases that cycle of going back into a detention facility. Another piece too is that medical care, including hormone replacement therapy, is often disrupted after release. Sometimes states do not provide HRT through state programs, so folks are not able to access that, and there's a huge disruption in the service that they're getting. So there's a lot of different challenges that folks face in reentry, and I know again Kai has done some incredible work with his organization, and just working with incarcerated transgender folks when they get released. And I'm wondering if you can share more about what you do with your organization, Kai, and also just any stories that you've heard from folks that are trying to re-enter the outside community.
Okay, Kris. So at Freedom Overround, we're a nonprofit organization that does direct support services for transgender and gender non-conforming individuals. We mostly work with the BIPOC community, but we do not discriminate from any person that obviously needs help. But for those individuals, those trans individuals that are coming home from the jails, prisons, and detention centers. A lot of those individuals do not have their um, identity documentation that they may need. They may not have a state ID, social security card, birth certificate, which are all things that they're supposed to get upon release from prison or jail, or those institutions. Um, so when they come home and they don't have those documents, they just give them a little small ID, and it's issued from the prison. And I think it expires in maybe 30 days. That's what they expect you to go and to, apply for jobs with, for housing, for medical, but they give you none of the other documents that you need. So over at Freedom Overground, what we do is we try to help each client, because each person is going to be at a very different level of their reentry. Some people may have those documents, their family may have kept them for them, or some people may not have those things. So what we do at Freedom Overground is we make sure all of the information that they need on how to apply, where to apply for those documents, or what it is that they may need to do in order to file for their name change. Because a lot of institutions will not allow a name change. I was told that it cannot happen because you're arrested under this name, and this is the name we're going to call you. So for those that are coming home and they need either, the name change documents or just whatever documents they need to get their things done, it's impossible for them to have them because the prisons and institutions, they don't give them out. And when it comes to getting medical care, and you're a trans man that has been locked up for maybe 8, 9 years in prison, and you come home, you don't come home with any HRT. They're not giving you that leaving out of the prison. They're supposed to, but they don't. They're supposed to give a 30-day supply. They don't give it to you. So you have to find a doctor that is willing to accept whatever documentation that you have from that prison or whatever institution you was in that showed that, hey, this is the amount of hormones I was receiving. This is the dosage. If you don't have all of that paperwork, it's going to be nearly impossible to get the care that we need. I had some of those same issues, and I had to um, request all of those documents before I left the prison about my medical needs, because I was told that a few other clients that came home and they didn't have those documents, and the doctors would not give it to them because the prison will not release that type of information to anyone other than the person that was incarcerated. Um, so I think I seen a question.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you covered it, Kai. It just all of those challenges make it incredibly difficult for someone when they're trying to enter back into the outside community. And it can make it really difficult for folks to figure out, who do I go to? Who can I trust? Where can I get these services? And there are some fantastic organizations like Kai's that do work with incarcerated transgender folks and formerly incarcerated transgender folks to help get folks back on their feet, knowing what services to use. And I do see in the chat someone asking about services in Washington. We will give our information at the end, and you're welcome to reach out to us. We do have some state-specific resources that might be helpful for you. So I wanted to put a question out to folks joining us today. I think Kai and I have talked a lot about different challenges that people might have. And I think, unfortunately, we know that these challenges that transmasculine people face prior to, during incarceration, and after incarceration, all of those things can have an impact on someone's ability to trust outside services, or even just to feel comfortable reaching out for support. And so I'm curious if folks want to pop in the chat, how might some of these challenges affect how someone may perceive and use your agency's services? So if you're hoping to be serving incarcerated transgender men, formerly incarcerated transgender men, it's important to think about like what perceptions might you have to overcome to make sure that people feel comfortable using your services. So if people want to put in the chat different ways that the challenges that people experience, how might that affect how someone perceives and uses your agency's services? And I'll give people a chance to put that in the chat. Yeah, I'm seeing a response here that some agencies have women in their name, and this can make trans men feel like they aren't included. Absolutely. Yeah, that can definitely be a barrier. Thinking about what's the name of your organization, right? Another person sharing that there might be barriers because of trust issues, being able to be vulnerable with advocates after being incarcerated. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. That's absolutely true. As Kai and I mentioned, systems have often failed transgender men time and time again. And so working with another agency, a new place, there might be a lot of issues with feeling like, yeah, this agency is actually going to work with me. They actually want to help me because they've been burned so many times before. Yeah. Other things that I'm seeing in the chat are stereotypes around domestic violence. Absolutely. About stereotypes being seen as something that men maybe don't experience, and that for masculine leaning people, it might be hard to seek those services. Absolutely. Distrust of systems and nonprofits is something else I'm seeing in the chat. Yeah. Thank you for adding all these. Yeah, all of these perceptions absolutely might make it difficult for someone to feel like, I want to reach out for help. I want to reach out to your agency. But I think there are some things that we can do to help overcome some of these things so that folks feel like our services are for them. So what can we do as advocates? Louis, if you want to shift the slide. Yeah. So not only can we practice solid one-on-one interactions with trans survivors in detention, but we can also make some changes on a more macro scale within our own agencies. And I think training, I can't overstate how important trainings can be. They're a really helpful tool in educating for cultural shifts. And I think it's just so important that we stay engaged in our own learning about the experiences of transgender men, that we're not asking transgender men to kind of like share the basics about their identity. That's what we have Google for. So utilize trainings, get your knowledge as best it can be. And the best that you can, try to help educate other folks at your staff and on your staff, other folks in your community. The more people we can get on board with just understanding the basics of LGBTQAI identities really makes a huge difference. If we can also learn about the laws and policies that affect trans people in your area, this can also be helpful. So we know kind of the different things that folks are facing, and just be open to learning about the language and terms used by the community. Also, things to think about are, what do your intakes and your forms say? Do you have a space where people can indicate their pronouns? Do you have spaces for people to indicate what name they use beyond their legal name? Kind of even thinking about like, what structures do we have at our agency that make it possible for trans folks, specifically trans masculine folks, to use our services? A really fantastic thing that I've seen some places do is to partner and have a heavy collaboration with their local or national LGBTQ+ organizations in their area. And so when folks are able to have that partnership, it can build a lot of trust. A lot of times trans folks might not feel comfortable reaching out to a rape crisis center, a dual agency, because they're not seen as always serving LGBTQ folks, but they will trust the local LGBT organization. So if there's a collaboration there, it can really enhance people's trust of your organization. You also want to make sure that your services are just applicable to men and transmasculine people in general. So this is especially true if you maybe only have a facility designed for women in your area, that you're still thinking about trans men, right? Because trans men are likely to be incarcerated at facilities for women. So this means thinking about any materials you have, making sure they're applicable, not just to women as survivors, but also to men, and that any advertisement you do also states that your services are available to folks of any gender, and that your services are truly open and applicable to survivors across the gender spectrum. And Kai, if you have anything you want to add to any of this, feel free to hop in.
Yeah, Kris, I just want to add one thing to this one. The one thing that I know from personal experience and also from speaking to our clients who are still incarcerated is that the biggest thing that advocates could do to help um, those that are inside or even those that are outside, and they come to these different organizations or people for help. The biggest thing that they could do is actually listen to the person, try to be understanding, and not be harsh or make them feel as if what they're saying isn't being heard. The problem that I faced the most when everything was going on, that led up to my incarceration, was even though at the rape crisis center everything came back as I said, they still made me out to be the bad guy because I did not look like a rape victim. And for those people that do try to reach out for help, please don't judge them by how they look, how they sound. Try to give them a chance, try to humanize, try to put yourself in their shoes, because that really tore me up, because the nurse pulled me to the side and said, well, you don't look like a rape victim. Your test, everything came back as you said, but you don't look like a rape victim. And it was just because of how I was dressed and how I identified at that time. And those should never be basis for you to look at another person and to make up in your mind that you're not going to give them help or that what they're telling you is not true. So always ask questions, always try to be respectful, and always give that individual a chance to, gain your trust and to build a rapport with you. Because once that happens, it will do wonders for that working relationship with you and that individual. Thank you, Kris.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what Kai is pointing to is that the power of listening, the power of believing, the power of asking questions and not assuming. Absolutely. And Lou, if you want to go to the next slide. Yeah. And, I think just the number one thing that folks have told me, and when I spoke to a transgender man, the number one thing that he identified with, that he said that would help support him and others, he said that all that they needed was just someone for us. And I think this could absolutely be you and your agency, which is why we want to take some time to talk about what kind of support services, how can you adapt them, how can you make them work so that transgender men really do feel like your services are for them, and that when you're working with somebody, that they're as helpful as they can be. Next slide. Yeah. A lot of trans folks in detention have not had access to things that would help them present consistently with their gender identity. And this is why it's so vital that we're never assuming someone's gender identity. So for example, say we're talking to someone on the crisis line that sounds like a woman, or we're sitting in front of a client in a women's facility that looks like a woman. It's really important that we're not going with that initial assumption, and that we really allow our clients to share with us what is their identity, and that we're always asking and allowing folks to share with us who they are, even if they don't look like how we think that they should look, right? When possible, we always want to ask what name and pronoun someone uses. This should be done regardless if someone seems transgender or not. A really great way to do this is just simply by introducing yourself first. So for example, I would say, my name is Kris. I use he, him, and they, them pronouns. What's your name? What pronouns do you use? That way you're modeling that behavior. You're modeling what are pronouns. You're modeling that you're sharing that as well. And then you're asking for it in return. If you're running groups and you've set a safe space within that group, it can also be a chance to allow folks to share their pronouns when you do introductions as well. That can be really helpful. When you're working with folks inside and someone shares what pronouns they use, and really in any circumstance, something you have to make sure you do is make sure that the rest of your language aligns with their gender identity. So for example, just using he, him pronouns is a piece of it, but we got to make sure the rest of our language matches. So for example, if you're working with a transgender man who lets you know that he uses he, him pronouns, you would want to use terms like father, brother, man, sir, mister, right? So we don't want to be using feminine terms to describe this person who's just shared with you that their gender identity is as a man, right? So when we're talking to a client, it's really important that we're just matching our language. And of course, everybody's going to use different language. Folks might feel comfortable with some terms and not with other terms, and certain things might feel right and not right. So it's really important to just check in and ask, right? And always be okay with folks maybe wanting to shift what language they use, really working with people to ensure that they're as comfortable as possible so that you can communicate with each other. That's the base, right? If we can't even be using someone's name, it's going to be really hard to figure out how can I support this person for their sexual assault, right? So we really have to make sure we have that base there. If you haven't had a chance to talk with a client about what pronouns they use, it's generally preferred if you try to use gender neutral language until you can figure that out, until you can ask that person and allow space for them to share that with you. Another piece that comes up, especially for folks on this call that maybe do accompaniment at forensic exams, if you're working with transgender survivors, it can be very difficult for someone to talk about their body during that exam or in general, especially if they've not been able to access any medical transition related care that they wish to. And you can be an advocate for them in that space. You can help them navigate conversations with a nurse or other people present about their bodies. You can always, always, always remind the survivor that they are in control during the exam, that they can stop, that they can take breaks. And you can also ask the client, what would they want their body parts to be referred to as? And this is, again, especially true for transgender men who maybe have the unwanted presence of breasts, but the nurse has to take a swab of that area. So instead of hearing the nurse using the word breasts over and over and over again, maybe that person uses the term chest to talk about their body. And all you have to do is just simply ask, what do you want that part of your body to be referred to as? And encourage the nurse to repeat that language. I think the other thing to think about is while it's okay to be curious about someone's identity, it is not that person's job to educate you. But it's also important to just be honest with ourselves about our own bias, our own knowledge, and to talk through with colleagues or with us if you have questions, that it's not really appropriate to be talking through that with your client or with a survivor that's in front of you. I think there's a lot that goes into trauma-informed services and trauma-informed care, and this is just a piece of the puzzle. And so we also want to take a moment to talk about how that relates to confidentiality, and also how we advocate on behalf of a survivor. I think one of the biggest differences when we're working with a survivor behind bars and working with a survivor in the outside community is sometimes there's an increased concern over safety and confidentiality. It's vital that we are incredibly clear about our confidentiality and that we can share that with our clients, because we do not want to out a survivor by mistake. So some things to ask the survivors you're working with who are incarcerated is to figure out, are they out as trans to staff? Do staff and other incarcerated people know what name they use? And are they comfortable with you using their name and pronouns in front of other people? And if they're not, making sure you come up with some sort of system so that you can still see them without outing them. So that might look like you using their legal name in front of other people to maintain their confidentiality, but using their true name and correct pronouns when you're in private spaces with them. But if they are out, maybe having a conversation with that person if you hear staff misgendering them, or if you hear other people using that person's their legal name and not the name they go by, how would they like you to correct that other person? Not everybody likes people to correct these things in the same way, right? Sometimes, most of the time, people don't want a big deal made out of it. I know I don't if someone misgenders me, because it can make it awkward and uncomfortable. But I'd much prefer if someone just said, you know what, actually, Kris uses he, him pronouns, right? And then just quickly move on. But it's really important that we're checking in with everyone we work with, because it's going to look different. And so this might add a little bit of time onto your interaction with the client, because you have to build that trust. You have to build that rapport with somebody. For folks that are receiving letters from incarcerated people, thinking about what name you use for them is also really, really important. Because if you're writing a letter back to a trans person hasn't had the ability to get a legal name change, you unfortunately can't write that person's chosen name on the outside of the envelope, because it's not going to get to that person. The prison or jail is probably going to reject that letter. So you're going to have to use their legal name on the outside of the envelope, but on the inside, on your actual letter to that person, that's where you can put their real name, the name that they go by. So just thinking about little nuances like that and having conversations with a survivor about them, so you're transparent about it, so that they know you're still respecting their identity, but want to make sure that they get the information that you're sending them, can really just ease a lot of the tension that can happen with that. Another thing to think about is when you're working inside correction facilities, it's likely that you're going to hear derogatory language specifically about transgender people. Trans jokes are commonplace in correctional facilities, and it's so important. And I think it goes without saying, but we do not want to be adding to these jokes, and nor do we want to be remaining silent. So while it's really important to have good relationships with the correctional facilities in our area so that we can really meet survivors and be able to provide services to them, it's still important for us to be professional and also to speak up. So, things that I found helpful are saying things like, I'm not comfortable with that language or term, or it's never someone's fault if they're sexually assaulted, or actually a more appropriate term is, and then give that appropriate language. Or even, I'm happy to provide more training on this community, right? Trainings can be so helpful. And if you and your agency provides maybe a trans 101, so that might be something that your corrections staff might be open to receiving. It can be helpful to identify who are your allies at the facility. It might not necessarily be the PREA compliance manager, or maybe it is, but there also might be a staff person who is part of the LGBTQ community who is willing to speak up and also might want your support. So they're building your allies at the facility. So again, you can increase access and increase the services you provide to survivors inside. When you're advocating for a client, you also might want to think about what PREA standards are in play, what policies are in place, so that way you can advocate on behalf of that client's rights. You're not the enforcer of their policies or of the standards, but knowing them can help give some backbone to what you're saying. And I did want to just briefly mention about advocating on behalf of a survivor. I noticed someone put something about this in the chat as well. But I think sometimes while we know that it can be very empowering survivors to make their own actions, their own choices, that speaking up on behalf of a survivor with their permission, especially if for a survivor who's already tried several remedies, has not been heard, this might be a place where we can provide some real support. And there's many reasons you might be asked to provide advocacy on behalf of an incarcerated survivor. And there might be some avenues where you might be able to really push for their rights to be met. So some of the most obvious times you might speak up on behalf of a client is if you feel like their immediate safety is at risk, again, with that person's permission. But if maybe they've tried to report the abuse several times, they know they have to see the abuser in the near future and they're worried about their safety. Maybe that person's facing retaliation or ongoing harassment. All of these are things that we might be able to advocate with facility staff or maybe even with an oversight agency to help get that person's situation changed. Other issues we might be able to address are things like housing, issues getting gender affirming property, issues getting hormone replacement therapy, medical needs, all these sorts of things. And I think sometimes advocates might be like, oh, well, that's a bit outside the scope of what I do. And it might seem that way, but all of those things, if someone's able to access them, they're able to heal because they are able to have their basic needs met. So if we're able to help folks get their basic needs met, we're going to be able to do our job even better. And I think it can be really hard. Sometimes we want to promise that we can do a whole lot for a survivor, or we might feel like, you know, I really want to make this change for somebody, but it's really important that we're being honest and we're careful not to overpromise anything. Because the reality is we can't just take someone out of the facility, right? So we don't want someone to get so excited that something's going to change when that might not be realistic. Your word probably does carry more weight than if someone inside is pushing for their own rights because you're an outside person. But this doesn't mean that what you're saying will necessarily change something for the survivor. So it's really important to discuss the risks and the possible benefits on advocating on behalf of them. And so I think the other thing with that as well is we want to make sure that we're just going over the pros and cons of advocating on someone's behalf and just being really transparent about it, letting the person know who you're going to talk to, what you're going to say, and just always keeping the survivor updated. For the advocates on the call, I think we can get really fired up about, you know, calling this person and that person and doing all these things. And we're maybe waiting to hear back from somebody, and then we forget to actually let the survivor know what's going on. They don't know what's going on unless we tell them. So really making sure we're keeping in contact with the survivor throughout the process so that they know you're making the steps that you said that you were going to do. So these are just a few of the tips that we wanted to present about advocating on behalf of a survivor, about thinking about confidentiality and just trauma-informed services. And we have just about 15 minutes left. And we did want to just see if there were other tips that might be useful when working with transmasculine survivors in detention that people on this call have tried. And so I want to give a chance for people to put in the chat, and also Kai, for you as well, if there are other tips that people have used when working with transmasculine survivors that they felt have been very, very helpful. We'd love to see it. I'm seeing a few things in the chat that folks put in earlier about consistent use of the correct pronouns. Absolutely, yeah. So we can't just use someone's correct pronouns one time. We have to do it throughout the time we're working with them. Another person mentioned really figuring out about what spaces are safe to even ask about safe use of pronouns. Absolutely. Michael Munson is putting in the chat about a really fantastic resource. Thank you, Michael, for adding this. For trans-specific resources on forensic exams, Forge has a webinar online about that. Thank you for sharing that. And I really encourage folks to check out Forge. They're a fantastic organization. Another person is adding, really just encouraging folks to connect with local trans and LGBT groups and really building those relationships. Absolutely. Another person is sharing, I advocated for a trans man who experienced sexual violence. They were being misgendered throughout the law enforcement investigation. They no longer felt safe reporting. In times where law enforcement is messing up, it is super important to find a detective or officer that is more aligned with the community to conduct interviews. Absolutely. Yeah, so if we can find allies, right? Find allies within the facility, figure out who's going to be supportive, who isn't going to just deny someone because of how they look or who they are, what identities they hold. Yeah. And I do want to uplift one of the questions that we're getting here about if transgender men are put into facilities for men or women. Thank you for asking that question. So pretty much across the board, except for in a handful of cases, most transgender men are placed into facilities for women. In a few cases, some transgender men have been placed in facilities for men. And the Prison Rape Elimination Act encourages facilities to really check in with that person to see where is going to be safest for them to be housed. And I'm just reading these wonderful comments in the chat. Another person is adding just about the importance of training. Really making sure that there's initial training for new employees. Love that. I love that. It sounds like that training is being led by the person who shared this, who is a trans mass survivor. Yeah. They're also sharing that even though they're in a rural area, they try to keep linked with other resources that might be in a different area. That's fantastic. Feel free to keep popping things in the chat, or if you have questions, to put them in the question and answer box. I do want to get a chance for us to just go through some of the resources that we have available through this project. But as we're closing this out, we are here to answer questions. So now's your time. There's no bad question, no wrong question. Here's the place to ask them. So feel free to put those in the chat or in the question and answer box.
Thanks, Kris. Thanks so much, Kai. Hi, everyone. I introduced this webinar at the top of the session, but if you joined after that, hello, I'm Louis. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm from the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. And yeah, so this training, I didn't say any of this at the top of the webinar because I guess I was just so excited to pass it over to Kai and to Kris. But this webinar is part of a project that NSVRC and JDI collaborate on. That's all about creating resources and providing support to advocates on working with men who are survivors of sexual violence. And so we do have an online toolkit with lots of resources available in both English and Spanish. And we are available to do things like training or answering your questions or helping you navigate the resources that are in that online toolkit, because there's a whole lot of them. And sometimes people like to just email and say, this is what I'm looking for. Can you just show me where it is? So we really definitely want you to check out those, and the recordings of this session, of course, will be posted online as well. And again, I mentioned this is part of an ongoing project that we have funded by OVW, and just want to share our references quickly, and remind everyone again that Kris and Kai are available to answer questions throughout the rest of the time that we have together. And there is one in the Q&A window. I wonder if Kai and Kris, do you have insight into this question, which is somebody who's saying that they're in a very quote unquote red state where trans rights are trying to be dismissed and the person's county lacks resources. So are there any resources that are offered to or out to state or beyond that local community? Are there national or state resources that can support somebody in that circumstance?
And Kai, I wonder if actually you can touch on this a little bit, because I know that you work in Georgia, which is a red state, right? So how do you navigate some of that, the difficulties of being in a place where our rights are being dismissed, while still really pushing for folks to be able to access services and have their rights be met?
For us over at Freedom Overground, what we do is most of the times we have to have some type of communication with those different institutions. And a lot of the times you're going to get, they're going to say, no, we don't, accept anything from anyone outside of certain groups or organizations that they may be familiar with. So when that happens, a lot of the times we have to reach out to different organizations. We're currently partnered with other organizations that also provide different services that we do not provide to our clients, but we are able to link our clients with those different organizations to get that mental health help that they may need, or to help them with different areas that they're seeking help, whether it's financial literacy. We're going to help at Freedom Overground. We're going to help more with the reentry process, obtaining all of the documentation they may need, with getting to whatever appointments they may have. But we don't just work in Georgia. We have some clients in Alabama, um, North Carolina, South Carolina, I want to say California, maybe one or two, and in Wisconsin, which is the federal facility. So we do have clients that are, just in different places. But in each of those states, I have to go in and I have to do a lot of research on those states, because no one state is the same. They all operate differently. So when you're in a place that does not provide services, or you can't find anything in that particular area, there are a lot of national organizations that do provide services. And one in particular that I know that is pretty good with transgender inmates that are incarcerated is Black and Pink, that I can think of off of the top of my head right now.
Yeah. Black and Pink, the Transgender Law Center.
Yeah, I forgot
There's
about
a
them.
Forge, a lot of places nationally that work with folks. And I love what Kai was sharing too, because sometimes it's figuring out like, what are these like really small organizations that might be in our community that we don't even know about? Or they might not be formalized organizations. It might just be like leaders in the community that are helping other trans folks, wisdom holders, people that maybe we're not thinking of as like a traditional organization, but are doing fantastic work. And so sometimes it's figuring out, how can I partner with them? How can I figure out what folks are already doing, what our community is already doing, and maybe even uplifting that. Sometimes, again, it's not like a formalized organization, but they can really go a long way in partnering with them and figuring out, what do trans folks in your community need and how can we support them?
And then we have a follow-up question in Q&A box that is saying, and Kai, are those services offered via web and video?
Yes.
And this is as Louis shared in the slide, there's an email here that you're welcome to contact us at, even though it will go to all of us. So Louis will kind of like funnel out who might be able to respond best to the different questions, but definitely use us as a resource. This is why we're here. We love talking about this. We care deeply about this issue. And we want to make sure you have the resources that you need so that incarcerated trans men can get the services that they deserve and they need. We have a few more moments for questions. So if anyone does have any burning questions you want to get answered, or anything you want to share, again, please feel free to use the question and answer function in Zoom, or feel free to pop it in the chat.
While that's happening, I just want to say thanks to all of you for attending today. Thank you to the whole team that is making this webinar possible. So thanks to Jamie and Amber, our live ASL interpreters. Thank you to Tamara and Erica, our live Spanish interpreters. Thank you to Faith, who was providing the live captions today. From the NSVRC team, thanks to Sarah and Jen, who are recording, so this can be made available after the webinar. And of course, biggest thanks to you, Kai and Kris. You shared some really great stuff over the course of the last 90 minutes. And I just want to highlight one comment about that, specifically from the chat. Someone said, and Kai, I'm extremely grateful to for your expertise. I'm so sorry you've had to experience those horrible things. I thank you for sharing, and please, please, please take good care of yourself after this meeting. Take a grounding break, do something fun, or dive face first into a mountain of delicious ice cream. You deserve all the good things you can do for what you've provided us today, with a heart emoji. So love that comment. And I don't see any other questions in the Q&A box, so I just want to turn it over to you both, Kai and Kris, to have the last word. Is there anything else that you didn't get a chance to say that you want to send us off with?
I just want to say thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you for being a part of this for 90 minutes, listening to us. And just a huge thank you to Kai. Kai, you're a total superstar. And I'm just it's such a pleasure to have time and space to share with you. And thank you for sharing your story.
I'm not a superstar. I want to actually just say, I'm pretty much echoing what Kris just said. A big thank you to each and every person that did join the webinar. It really takes a lot to kind of a lot of work in the background to kind of put things together, but it was definitely worth it. And I hope that this information that we were able to present you guys with will help you along the way in providing care for those individuals, because it's a lot of work that goes into it, and people don't see all the work in the background that we do as advocates and as people that offer to support to those individuals that are so marginalized. But thank you guys so much for tuning in, for listening to us, and we're just thankful that you guys are here.
Thanks for that send off, Kris and Kai. Thanks again, everyone. Thanks for joining. Have a good day. Have a good week.